Good morning. My name is Nefertitti Jackmon. I serve as a Community Displacement Prevention Officer for the City of Austin, and I work within the Housing Department. My area of expertise, or the skills that provide me expertise in this area, I will say I've worked in the nonprofit industry for more than 25 years, both as an executive director and in programming. And I think those skills and experience have helped me be able to deploy programs that are relevant to the way people live their lives in housing. And so my team and I were responsible for deploying over $100 million in emergency rental assistance and other tenant stabilizing services throughout the pandemic. Additionally, I will say I am new to the housing sector, and in my first couple of years, I was a little timid because of that lack of experience in housing. And as I spoke with someone who had been in housing for many years, she said, "Have you ever rented?" I said, "Yes." "Have you ever bought a home?" I said, "Yes." "Have you ever had a foreclosure?" I said, "Yes." Didn't want to say yes, but I said yes. And I thought about my experience individually in housing. And she said, then don't say you don't have experience, because it gives me a very unique lens and a lived experience, just as Assistant City Manager Rodney Gonzalez mentioned Senator Edward Brooke and his knowledge to write that bill that became the landmark legislation that we are here to celebrate and acknowledge today. So I think that lived experience is very important in opening up opportunities and programs for the way vulnerable households and people live today. Thank you.
Good morning. Thanks for the opportunity, first of all. I think this is a great conference, a great opportunity. My name is Nelson Linder. I'm the president of the Austin NAACP. This is my 23rd year in that position. I address all forms of discrimination, housing, police brutality, education, you name it, we do it. I want to say this: I was born in the great state of Georgia in 1958, and I'm a big fan of the Civil Rights Act of '64. I always like to play with folks and say, I came from Georgia, so I kind of experience what I'm talking about. If you're from Georgia, no pun intended. I came to Austin in 1980 as a student from the military. I'm also an insurance agent professionally, Allstate, Mutual of Omaha, Linder Insurance Agency. I've had a wide range of experiences in this city since I've been here, and I've been busy, I think, in a lot of different aspects. I think this conference is so important, so that's why I'm so honored to be here, because given what you do in these times, it is more so critical than ever. And so while we're learning about what we can do to help alleviate the issues that we're facing, we're also, I think, learning new things about practices, approaches, what works, and the total impact of what we're doing. And I say again, my life story, I think, prepared me better than anything else, coming from the Southeast to whatever. I guess Austin is somewhat the Southwest and Southeast. Hadn't quite figured that out, but I'm still learning. But I will say I'm happy to be here. I think these are very, very serious times, and hopefully, beyond the conference, we can also engage in what we're doing as far as impact to make sure that the folks who have this problem understand how to, first of all, write a complaint, organize the information, establish the premise, and also articulate the supporting evidence. Because how you arrange your data and how you organize your data, make a presentation, is the key to what we're doing. And so I'm happy to be here. I'm excited about this program, and look forward to a very inspirational, inspiring conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Les.
Hi, my name is Amanda Masino. I'm an associate professor of biology and chair of natural sciences at Huston-Tillotson University, Austin's historically black college or university. I have been on the faculty there for about 13 years. It's been a real pleasure to work at HT. And one of my capacities there is working with our research students. Another capacity is working on our environmental justice program. I'm the director of our environmental justice program. And in a combination of those roles and in a combination of what I do in my own community work, I've been able to do some research on affordable housing. A lot of our model of research at the university is community engaged and taking our scientific tools to try to understand social justice impacts and social justice goals. And so through that, I've been fortunate to partner with the Austin Housing Repair Coalition and look at their program and how it affects anti-displacement and the residents of the health who participate in that program. We've done some follow-up work to see if we can track those impacts over time. And we're currently looking at more interventions to help people who are in affordable housing achieve better health outcomes. So that's a lot of my area of work and what brings me to this conference. And it is a real pleasure to be invited to speak with you all today.
Thank you.
The racial divide in Austin used to look a lot different than it does today. After the Civil War, Austin was seen as sort of a refuge for freed slaves, safe from most of the racial violence that plagued the South. By 1880, the city's African-American population lived in pockets spread throughout the city. It was as geographically integrated as Austin has ever been. In 1928, a new city plan was put in place. The Supreme Court had ruled that explicit zoning laws pushing segregation were unconstitutional. So the city leaders got a little creative. If you were an African American and wanted access to public services like schools and parks, you had to live in a so-called Negro district, newly formed on the east side of town. By 1940, you can see how the once dispersed African American population had become concentrated in one area. A few years later, the segregation was cemented. The federal government, in an effort to build wealth following the Depression, began backing mortgage loans. But they wouldn't back these mortgage loans in certain high-risk neighborhoods that were redlined. Minority neighborhoods were virtually always redlined. The effect was that African Americans were left on the outside of what would become one of the largest wealth drivers in U.S. history. Fast forward to now, Austin's population has boomed since the 1970s. The region's development has swept away many of the historically black schools, neighborhoods, and business centers that served as cultural anchors for the community. Rising property values and taxes have forced many African American families to seek more affordable housing in the suburbs. Left with a smaller percentage of black residents in the city, the ties between Austin's African American minority and its Anglo majority have weakened. There are efforts by some in the African American community to rebuild these business and cultural institutions. But reforging the connections requires work from both sides of the racial divide. Without a proactive and concerted effort to reintegrate, Austin will do little more than maintain its divided status quo.
How have the effects of the 1928 plan in creating inequities for communities of color still exist today? Yes, each of you, for each of the panels.
Before I answer that question, I want to give a little context that might differ from the narrative for this reason. In 1865, after the end of the Civil War, we had a group called the Freeman Bureau that came in to address the impact of slavery. And so what they did was, for the black folks who were going into freedom, they gave them some land. And our people moved out into different areas of the city. They called those now the 15 or more settlements. And in those settlements, they were very independent and very self-sufficient. They were doing quite well all over the city. But what happened is, it happened all over the South, by the way, is our government and other folks in these cities decided to put black folks in one place. That's called the Master Plan of 28. So it's very important to know the context, understand the present. What happened is that those settlements basically died. And so you have what I call government-based discrimination by putting folks in one area, promising and saying, if you don't do this, you don't get resources. That's a very different context, right? And as a result, they established a precedent in this city where black folks didn't have access to opportunities. And as a result, number one, it decreased our ability to earn income. And the loans were racist, so we couldn't buy homes. And so it created a huge wealth gap back then that still exists today. So the biggest thing is that beyond what you see is the obvious discrimination. If you examine the median income gap in this city, in this country, black folks are at a certain level because, number one, that we didn't have the advantage of having inherited wealth that we could invest in for our current generations. So when you see Austin today, in many ways it's the same thing, but in a more complicated fashion. The fact that in this city today in 2023, without median income that matches the cost of living, without opportunities that give you the opportunity to invest, you're going to have a huge, huge wage gap, and that leads to even more discrimination in housing, job opportunities, and those kinds of things. Now, unfortunately, and I'm getting to close, that context never really addressed. So the policy is obviously affecting where we are today. And as a result, because of lack of I think of a premise that's true, we don't have the proper impact. We're going to have to address the causes head on, because that's where it begins, then begin to address the symptoms, or what I call the implications. That means being very honest about what happened, but also formulating policies that invest in what we created. We don't tend to do that. So until you make a decision to invest in what you create, you can't nullify and neutralize the impact of current day discrimination almost in every category: economics, employment, education, healthcare, neighborhood sustainability, and of course, police brutality. Thank you.
Thank you, Linder. Yeah, she has her own mic
Yeah,
now.
I'm
You
a-
can keep yours.
Hear me now? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, One of the things that we have to understand about planning processes is that they take time, right? They take time. First, there's the vision. Then there's the cost of doing the investments to lay out the plans that the great minds have had. One of the things that I often speak about is the 1928 plan. What we see today was a direct result of that, and so it was an effective plan. Did it have a negative impact? Absolutely. But the plan, based on the vision to have a segregated city, was very effective. And so this is why today we have to be involved in the planning processes, and oftentimes communities of color, renters, and those without or with limited resources are often not at the table at these planning processes. So we continue to hear dominant voices of homeowners and wealthier individuals, and so there is nothing that has changed. A ULI report in 2017 stated and showed that, and I'm sure many of you have heard this, Austin was one of the most economically segregated city in Texas, and if not the nation, right? And as Mr. Nelson Linder stated, when you don't have access to economic wealth and income, it impacts your life in so many other areas, from an educational perspective, from home ownership perspective, health outcomes. And so one of the challenges that we have is our reluctance, if you will, to deal with these challenges. What we know what happened were the inequitable outcomes. So if you had inequitable outcomes that stemmed from 1928, the only way that you can address them is through equitable outcomes, right? That's easy. But we are stuck on narratives which sound good, and we create an equity office. We create an office of civil rights. We create a displacement prevention division. But what we are afraid to do as a city is to provide the restitution, to provide and invest in outcomes that are equity focused. And what equity focused means, it's painful. It is painful for us to hear that and have that discussion, because what we believe it means is that one group is going to get something that I'm not gonna get. But if you look at what another group has already gotten, and to continue to give everybody the same, we are never balancing or addressing. And one of the things, if we're a country based on laws of fairness and justice and equity, what it means is past rights must be corrected and redressed. And that's what we're afraid to do. So I'll stop there. I have one other point, but I'll stop there. But you can see it. It is evidence for many black families. The early voting has started. I was at a block party on East 11th Street last weekend, and they had someone trying to encourage people to vote. And I said, I can't vote. And many, they said, we're hearing this from so many black people. You know why we can't vote? We've been displaced out of Austin. We can't even afford, even though we work here and play here, and we are impacted by the police laws and everything else, we don't even have a voice. And so those are the continuing legacies that we see today as a result of policies like the 1928 plan.
Thank you. We'll talk about the displacement a little further in the conversation. Dr. Masino?
Yeah, I mean, I think my fellow panelists have said it. We've seen the impacts of 1928 on the landscape of the city today, on black health, on black wealth, like very prominently. As far as the wealth conversation, there's a study being done by researchers at UT and Huston-Tillotson, led by Dr. Gordon at UT, looking at quantifying that. So can we figure out what the dollar amount is of what has been lost? And their initial figure is $290 million. And that's looking at only 5 neighborhoods, Wheatsville, Clarksville, East Campus, South Austin, and Red River, and only looking at the people who were displaced by 1928. So people who were forced out of Wheatsville, relocated because the services were relocated or when the schools were closed, when Wheatsville School was closed in 1931. Not yet looking at what happened during the whole era of redlining, because that's going to add, right, to that loss of property, loss of value, loss of generational wealth that impacts everything. So that's a big area. On the health front, we have in Austin big disparity in lifespan between different zip codes. And we're not unique in this, but we're certainly not in the bottom tier. We are among the top cities in terms of the difference in life expectancy between different zip codes. If you're not familiar with it, I urge you to check out Texas Health Maps. It's a little tool you can put in your zip code, look at Austin, look at Travis County. You can see this 15-year disparity where you live determining how long you live, which speaks to all of the factors in your landscape that can affect your health. And on that third point, I want to add to the video by saying not only were services for Blacks put into the east side to create this district, but also the zoning in that part of Austin was more permissive of industrial development. So you were forcing people into an area that was also going to have light industry, more potential for environmental exposure, water, air, soil, everything. And you can't separate that, right? What remains in the landscape, what you're exposed to, that carries over generations as well. Right? My background is in genetics. And I don't know if how many of you in the audience are familiar with the field of epigenetics, but we know that what you inherit from your parents, from your grandparents, is not just your DNA, but you inherit how active the DNA is, right? Women who go through famine, for example, they will inactivate the genes that use a lot of energy. So their kids and their grandkids can eat a normal amount and be predisposed to gain weight because they're sort of pre-programmed for that famine thing that happened to their grandmother. Well, what happens when you have environmental exposures in your soil, in your water, in your air, and that affects your kids and your grandkids, right? It goes 2 generations that way. It can go to generations that way. So we're looking at profound impacts in every area of life from this plan.
Thank you. Our next question is moving a little further into resolution. What steps have been taken to bring resolution or acknowledgement to the effects in a way where we are honoring the legacy and the communities that were displaced with the plan? You guys had started going down that road. So.
I want to mention again one point for context. During the Emancipation era, there was a fellow named Arthur Beatty Whitty, was the NAACP president. He noted back then that your political system must align with your stated goals and objectives. Otherwise, you're wasting time. He challenged the entire city to hold fair election. He ran for office, a complete white slate, essentially. And according to the folks who know, he won a place, but the votes were not counted. And so the city of Austin, seeing that challenge by a black man, went to what we call the at-large political system. And to be honest about everything, if you're saying that you want to treat equity and indiscrimination, your political system must align with what you're saying. So we have to take the blinders off at the time and be very direct. If you got an at-large system that sends all the resources to zip codes west of I-35, it ain't happening east of 35. And we don't really deal with that. So in 2013, the NAACP, yes, Nelson Linder, we challenged the old at-large plantation system and created a 10-to-1 system where we got folks now that have reps in every district. Now, it's slowly working, but the problem is you got a lot of damage already done, and so the resources still don't go to where they're intended. So I'll say, to fast forward this whole conversation and what we're trying to do, we noticed from day one that the resources don't go to where they need to go. That's not rocket science, really. If you don't invest in infrastructure, jobs, and it creates itself, you're not going to address these kinds of issues. So as far as how do we address the symptoms, you got to address the problems and the causes. Let me just say this, I'm an insurance agent for 35 years. Corporate America, Beach of Omaha, Allstate. I see redlining every day, and people are still in denial about redlining, where East Austin, we pay a high rate for insurance because we're in East Austin. So if you want to address these things, it's like being a physician. You take the symptom, then you identify where to start. You got to address where the stuff begins. That means you got to invest in what you created. That means specific numbers of wealth to address what you caused. But it's very hard to get there because there's so many circular conversations. So every other year, somebody got a different plan. So I say, seriously, if you examine the United Nations, that covers the whole world, they got specific examples of how you handle restitutions and reparations. It's a meaningful system. It happened in Rwanda, it happened in Israel. But America doesn't want to deal with that. So I say resolutions means it ain't coming from the government. It's got to be a panel with authority, with vision, with courage, with honesty to call a spade a spade. And that recommendation that's made from that panel can't be entirely political. It's got to be standing with the power to stand scrutiny and what we always see, which is interference. So we can address these issues. The question really is not necessarily a resolution, but are people really committed? And I can tell you, as I close out, if you're going to stand in this city, and any city in America, and talk about ending racism and the impact of racism or any disparate impact group, you're going to be highly criticized. So the question is, what price are you willing to pay to change this problem? You can change the problem and solve it, but oftentimes the folks in power, they're not going to just give up power. So while you're talking about resolutions, impact, you've got to talk about having a plan of action that can be legally implemented that stands. And again, if you got 5 zip codes west of I-35 that took everybody taxpayers' money east of I-35, that requires immediate restitution. The only question is, how do we get there? We've got to educate people politically. We've got to rewrite some of this history and tell what really happened. And I'll still say, I learned a lot more in 1865 when people went out in the city and did wonderful things. By the way, for those who don't know, between 1865 and 1877 was called Black Reconstruction. It was our greatest era of progress in American history. There are lessons there about building your own institutions, banks. The NAACP started a bank in 1968, by the way, at 1704 East Shore Street. It lasted for 30 years. In 1998, they went out of business, and guess who bought them? Most folks can answer that question. A place called Greater Texas Federal Credit Unions. So all these things can be done, but you gotta have leadership that is committed to doing what needs to be done. That means it's gonna be very unpopular, criticized, but we got here based on folks who are unpopular and criticized. So the solution is, are we gonna stand up and admit what we've done and quit blaming the victims for this situation and invest resources, what needs to go to address it? We've done it in other places. That's the solution. It's having an honest, hard conversation that's backed up by investments. We call it money. It goes where it needs to go without compromise.
Let's see, here, use mine.
Maybe because I have no nails, I don't know, I can't press the button. But I'll start where Mr. Linder left off and talking about investments. So as I shared, I am the Community Displacement Prevention Officer, and we have two sort of branches of our division. One is strategic development, looking at the data, looking at plans and the development of policies to address and analyze displacement pressures and then help us identify where investments need to be made. And then the other arm is are the strategic investments. And that's what we use, strategic investments, because what we're talking about is addressing where the lack was. So when we're talking about vulnerable households and what people have not received, what historically underrepresented communities did not receive, people sometimes complain, well, why are we giving this money there? These are investments. These are investments into the lives of individuals so that their children and the households can have significantly different outcomes. These are public dollars. If we don't do the investment in the beginning, we eventually will pay at the end, right? Whether it's for healthcare costs, when we don't provide economic mobility opportunities for families. So one of our primary goals is to provide the investments in the beginning, and it's primarily around housing, but not only housing, right? We understand, let me answer the question, because I feel like I'm going to displacement, and I don't want to go to displacement, because I think that's one of her next questions. But we were just talking about the legacy. So one of the reasons we do the investments is to address what we didn't do in the past. I think a lot of what has been done to recognize and honor the legacy is happening on a community level and not on a city or state level. So Dr. Andrea Roberts, she has the Texas Freedoms Colonies, right? And she's doing a great job with that. She was at Texas A&M, now she's in Virginia, but mapping those communities, documenting the history of how those communities thrived and how those communities existed after Reconstruction. And I'm also reading The Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois. Should have read it a long, long time ago. But Nelson Linder is again right. It was one of the most prosperous times. Reconstruction was one of the most prosperous times for African American communities. But it was stopped. And he talks about the fact that it was stopped before the work was done. It was stopped because it was effective. And people saw that it was effective. So access to land, access to having vote and representation in Congress, just imagine had we been able to progress as a country on equal footing. So Texas Freedom Colonies, there's also 6 Square, which is and has been supported, I will say, as a result, though, of community members pushing for something different, and then the Economic Development Department supporting Six Square. And so that history of African American community in East Austin has been preserved. And so that's another thing, but I still think it's the push of the community. And finally, I'll say, even the fact that the Displacement Prevention Office exists and the Equity Office exists, it's been as a result of pushes and momentum from the community. And what I hope we don't do is get comfortable with a black and brown aesthetic in Austin, where we merely have the murals and stores and street names that represented or representative of the families and people who used to live there, without having the existence of black and brown bodies in East Austin and populating those areas.
Well said. Thank you. Dr. Masino, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add. I absolutely agree. I think that a lot has been done by community organizations, by others, to look at the history, to acknowledge, to highlight the what was lost, what is retained, all of those things. I don't think we do enough of that broadly in terms of the education. I think we also have a tendency to frame it as if 1928 plan happened, and then everything was fine, and we're just seeing the impact of that one event. But no, it has been continual layers of overt and covert racism, systemic and other, that has affected this and is in the situation we are today. So it's not like Austin is now a beacon of racial equity and we're just dealing with this event from 1928 and trying to correct for what happened. No. We have active racism, structural and otherwise ongoing, that also needs to be reckoned with. So it makes it very challenging, and I don't think we like talking about all of the steps in between that got us here, right? Up to and including what Mr. Linder was talking about, the political structure in the city and how that continues to be challenging in many ways. We are the only Texas city whose increase in size in the 2020 census was due to an increase in the white population living in the city. That's not because our Black and Hispanic population stayed static in size. No, it's because they moved out of the city to the suburbs because the cost of living in Austin is ridiculous. And so we're continuing to see that, and that's going to continue to affect the landscape of what we can accomplish structurally in the city.
Thank you. We just got a 5 minutes left sign come up, so we have to wrap this up. Let's see. I guess, what are we learning from our history? What is the continued impact on fair housing? How are we addressing future housing development plans? So maybe I'll just give each of you a question and you answer the question. Dr. Masino, we'll start with you. How are we learning from this history?
Well, I hope we're learning that we have to treat housing holistically. It's not just about housing. That affects every area of life. One thing in particular that I'm paying attention to, and I'm sure many of you are as well, is what's happening with education in this state. Right? I think this is a lesson of 1928. So 1917, the Supreme Court bans overt segregation for residences. Right? But we still had segregation in place in the schools, which is why what the city was able to do is move the schools to force the movement of the population. So what you do in the schools does affect the patterns of where you live and vice versa. So I think we need to be paying attention to that.
Thank you. Mr. Linder, what is the continued impact it has had on fair housing?
Well, obviously, a lot of our folks have lost our property. They've been displaced. So I would say basically what I'm sensing and seeing as an insurance agent, because most of my clients now are no longer in East Austin. And so you're going to have to come up with a way to build affordable housing. I don't mean the way you define it. I'm going to call it low income, because right now a lot of our people, black and brown people, are in low income categories. Are you willing to do that? So you're going to have a specific initiative that ignore the chatter and the insults and build housing for black and brown people and folks who fit that category. We haven't done that. Now, I always got to be honest, okay? We've had two major initiatives the past 10 years in Austin, Texas, starting back in 2013. One was called the Spirit of East Austin. Well, that spirit was never revived, the soul died. Nothing is there. One was called the impact of institutional racism. It's probably greater than ever. So again, we need folks in power, and our communities are great. They're not the problem. The budget's downtown. Those folks have to understand you're going to have to be criticized and put money in these programs. As far as housing, you got to redo the whole process. Take the money where it needs to be spent, follow it through. Don't give it to all your community people, leave them out in the desert. You got to make sure you support them. Oftentimes, I see folks who do this work, they're in small offices on this street and that street. I never see the city council. So if you're going to make a deal, you need to empower your people hand in hand and make sure you listen to them, but also give them a big checkbook and a big pen so they can sign those checks.
That's right. Thank you, Officer Jackman. How are we addressing future housing development plans?
Okay, one of the things that we are doing, she gave me that question. I wanted the other question because I had something. I will say quickly, we need, as community members, we really need your voices to, one of the things we need to end income discrimination around housing, right? People should be able to use vouchers in the state of Texas. So that's a big one that I really think we need to see. And finally, I will say, one of the things we're doing, we developed a racial equity anti-displacement tool. We need, and I'm saying we, the housing department, but sometimes we need a push from you. So we've developed this tool, and this tool should be used for development projects so that we can center community voices. We need you to know about this tool. We need you to ask, are we using this tool? Well, why aren't we using this tool? Well, how can we get different outcomes? It exists. It's a racial equity anti-displacement tool, and it is on our housing website for the city of Austin. We need to look at how we're doing development and really have community-driven development projects where we can achieve greater equitable outcomes for everyone in Austin.